London, October 1966. Soho, a Tuesday night. The club was the kind of place that didn't have a sign out front worth reading. 40 seats maybe. Walls the color of old tobacco. A stage barely wide enough for two people standing close, and an amp in the corner that buzzed faintly even when nothing was plugged into it. Jimi Hendrix had been in London for 3 weeks. He sat at the corner table farthest from the stage, back to the wall, a glass of water in front of him. He was wearing a patterned shirt he'd bought off Carnaby Street 3 days ago. The kind of thing nobody in Seattle would have let him walk out of a store wearing. He liked that about London. The color, the noise, the fact that people on the street looked at his clothes instead of his face. Nobody in that room knew who he was. That was still possible then. The man running the evening was Roy Hatch, 26 years old, Berkshire accent he'd spent 2 years trying to soften. He'd come to London with a guitar and a notebook full of original songs, and somewhere along the way the songs had stopped coming and the notebook had turned into a clipboard with a set list on it. He wasn't bitter about it exactly. He just found a different way to be important. He had a way of standing at the mic with one hand in his back pocket, like he was doing everyone a favor by being there. That night he'd put together a small jam session, 4 or 5 players rotating through. The audience was 20, maybe 25 people, musicians mostly, a few journalists, the kind of room where everyone had a quiet opinion about everyone else's playing and kept it to themselves until the set was over. The third act up was Danny Cole. He was 20, maybe 21. He'd been chasing a particular sound for about 6 months. The left-hand technique, the way of bending strings until they sounded like a human voice asking a question it already knew the answer to. He'd learned it off a second-hand record he'd found in a bin near Portobello Road. He didn't know the name of the man who'd made it. He just knew the sound. Danny plugged in and played for about 8 minutes. He hit the notes, all of them more or less. The fingers moved fast and the tone was clean, and the room gave him decent applause when he finished. Earned applause. The kind that means fine work, not remarkable work. Roy stepped up beside him and clapped him on the shoulder. "Nice one, mate. Real control through that middle section. Few rough edges, but solid stuff." He said it the way a teacher says it when the student has done well enough, but not well enough to threaten anything. Then he turned back to the room. "Anyone else want to get up and give us something?" The voice came from the corner table. Not loud, not performing, just a voice that cut through the room the way a clear note cuts through noise. "He's fretting with his ring finger on the pull-offs. Should be his middle. Gives you more strength on the release. The phrase opens up when you do it right." A few people turned to look. Roy turned to look. He saw a man at the corner table. Patterned shirt, glass of water, sitting completely still. Roy had a smile he kept ready for moments like this. Polite on the surface. Something else underneath. "Cheers for that," he said into the mic. "Though I'd say there's a fair distance between knowing the theory and actually playing the thing." He let that land. Then, "Stage is right here, mate. Guitar's right there. If you reckon you know it better, come on up and show us." The room waited. The man at the corner table didn't move. He raised one hand, just slightly, just enough, and set it back down on the table. A quiet wave, the kind that means I'm fine right where I am. Roy shrugged at the room. "Didn't think so." A few people laughed. Not cruel exactly, just easy. At the corner table, Jimmy picked up his glass of water and took a slow sip. The door opened 4 minutes later. Paul McCartney had been in Soho since 8 o'clock. Dinner with a friend near Dean Street, 2 hours of conversation, and then the friend had gone home and Paul had kept walking. He did that sometimes. Walked until the city drowned out whatever he was trying not to think about. Dark jacket, collar up, hands in his pockets. On a street like this at this hour, most people didn't look twice. The music reached him before the door did. He stopped on the pavement, stood there listening to something spill out from a doorway ahead of him. Then he pushed the door open and stepped inside. It took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust. The stage was lit with a single overhead lamp. The amp was buzzing its faint, familiar buzz between songs. Paul let his gaze move through the room. The tables, the bar, the faces, the way you do when you're not expecting to find anyone you know. Then he went still. He looked at the corner table. Looked again. Stayed very quiet for a moment. The way you stay quiet when something surprises you and you haven't yet decided what to do about it. He crossed the room. He sat down across from Jimi Hendrix without announcing himself, which was a thing Paul McCartney almost never got to do anymore. "When did you get here?" he asked. "3 weeks ago," Jimmy said. Paul nodded. He looked toward the stage where Roy was shuffling through his clipboard, then looked back. "I was watching from the door just now. What happened?" "People were looking at your table." Jimmy gave him the short version, a sentence or two, no drama in the telling. Paul listened. Then, "You going up?" "No need for it." Paul looked at the stage again. He'd seen Jimmy play 6 days ago at a venue 10 minutes from here, and the sound had stayed with him the way things stay with you when they're genuinely new. Not obsessively, but surfacing unbidden, at odd moments. A sound like that deserved more than a Tuesday night in a room this size. "Maybe not," Paul said quietly, "but I'd like to hear you play." Jimmy sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up. He walked to the stage without making much of it. No announcement, no request for attention. He picked up the house Stratocaster, cream-colored, a cigarette burn near the tone knob, the strap repaired with electrical tape, and plugged it in. He adjusted the amp without asking anyone's permission, spending a few quiet seconds listening to the room the way you listen to a room before you say something important into it. He ran his thumb across the strings once, made 2 small adjustments to the tuning by ear. Then he closed his eyes. Nobody was watching yet. Then Jimmy started playing. The first thing people noticed was the silence. Not the silence of him playing quietly. The silence of everything else stopping. It moved through the room in layers. The couple near the door went quiet first, mid-sentence. Then the journalists at the bar. Then the musicians near the stage who'd been murmuring to each other. One by one, as if something was passing through the room and gently taking conversations away. Until the only sound was the guitar and the low hum of the amp. What Jimmy was playing didn't announce itself. No dramatic opening, no signal that something important was beginning. He started inside an idea and let it move outward. And what moved outward made the room feel different, smaller, closer, more honest than it had been 60 seconds before. Danny Cole was standing near the side of the stage, arms crossed at first, then uncrossed. Then his hands dropped to his sides, and he stood there with the posture of someone who has been shown, very gently, something they cannot argue with. Roy Hatch had not moved from his spot near the amp. He stood watching the hands. The left hand, moving up and down the neck with a certainty that looked almost casual. The right hand, doing 3 things at once and making none of them look difficult. He watched and understood, the way you understand something when you genuinely rather not, that the man he gestured toward the stage 20 minutes ago as a polite joke had been doing him a considerable favor by staying in his seat. Paul McCartney stood at the back of the room. He'd found a spot near the wall, and he stayed there with his arms at his sides and his face still, not unmoved, still, like someone who has learned that the right response to something rare is to get out of its way. The last note dissolved. Jimmy rested his palm flat against the strings, and the sound softened and ended. The room was quiet. 3 seconds. 5. Someone near the back started clapping, slowly, like they were thinking while they did it. Then one more. Then everyone, in that particular kind of applause that doesn't sound like celebration so much as recognition, the acknowledgement of something witnessed. Paul pressed his hands together twice and stopped. It felt like enough. Roy walked toward the stage. He had something prepared, a professional sentence or two, neutral and composed. He got within a few feet of Jimmy, and the sentence left him. He stood there with his mouth open slightly, holding nothing. Jimmy looked at him. Then, and this was the thing people in that room would carry with them for years. Jimmy smiled, unhurried, easy, without any edge to it. "You put me on the stage," Jimmy said. "That's what I needed." Roy had no answer for that. He'd walked over to recover something, and instead he was standing there with less than he'd arrived with, and somehow the man in front of him had made that feel like a gift. Paul and Jimmy left together about 20 minutes later. Outside, the October air came at them immediately, cold, sharp. The street was quiet for Soho, A taxi went past. Somewhere a block away, someone was laughing at something. They walked without a destination for a while. 3 weeks, Paul said, not quite to himself. Yeah, Jimmy said. Paul didn't say what he was thinking. He was thinking, 3 weeks. And already this. He was 24 years old and had been in the biggest band in the world for 3 years, and thought he had a reasonable sense of how rare certain things were. He was quietly revising that. They walked a little further and Jimmy stopped to look in a music shop window. Closed for the night, a guitar on a stand behind the glass. And Paul stopped beside him. Come to Abbey Road sometime, Paul said. I want to show you something we've been working on. All right, Jimmy said. They stood there a moment longer. Then they walked on. In his jacket pocket, Jimmy had a letter from Chaz Chandler. A meeting tomorrow, bookings, sessions, contacts, the machinery of building a name in a city that didn't know your name yet. The calendar was already filling. He thought about it for a moment, walking through the quiet street beside Paul McCartney. Then he let it go. The night was cold, and somewhere behind them, in a room with 40 seats and a buzzing amp, a small crowd was still settling back into itself. Still trying to locate the before and the after. The exact moment when something in the room had changed. Jimi Hendrix died on September 18, 1970. He was 27 years old. Paul McCartney heard the news and sat with it for a long time. He thought about the shows he'd seen, the sounds that had come out of that man's hands that nobody could quite account for. He thought about a Tuesday night in October 1966, a corner table, a glass of water, a man who had been in London for 3 weeks. Many years later, an interviewer asked what he remembered most about Jimi Hendrix. Paul was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks, he said. He'd been in London 3 weeks. He didn't explain what he meant by it. He didn't need to.